Hey, I am very excited to give today's lecture because it is about the shell. The shell is extremely cool because in Linux you will be doing pretty much everything on it. There is no command that you won't be able to do through the shell, and the shell will let you do those commands extremely powerfully. In short, the shell is your home. Now, there are a few different properties that any given home can have. For instance, your shell in particular might be pretty interactive. And what interactive means is that you give it a command and then it'll execute that command, then you can give it another one. Your shell is also pretty customizable, which means that everything about your shell you can change. So you can change what it looks like, you can change the overall touch and feel of it, you can change exactly what the names of the commands you are, and we'll go a lot more into how to customize your shell in future lectures. And also, the shell is very powerful. That's why people in Linux and Unix prefer using the shell, because a graphical user interface might be a little bit easier, it might have a little bit less of a learning curve, but if you have a shell, you can do pretty much anything. You can grab all of the files in every subdirectory and put them into a current directory, or you can take all of the text files that were edited after a certain date and move them into a new folder, or you can delete all of the old files or something like that. Your shell is extremely powerful, and today we're going to give you a taste of how to make your shell as easy as possible. Now, in terms of shells, there are two big ones. There is C shell, and that's CSH, and there's also bash. C shell is a little bit older, and then bash came around. Bash stands for Born Again shell. There was originally a shell called the Born shell that was a competitor of C shell, but then bash came along and just kind of took everybody off their feet. Bash was a lot better, bash was easier to use, so nowadays pretty much everybody uses bash, or a bash variant rather than C shell. Bash is the shell that's installed by default on Ubuntu. Now, when I said there were a lot of bash variants, what I meant was that there are a lot of shells that are pretty much the same as bash, but they might have a few bells and whistles added on. One of those variants is called Z shell. Z shell is very cool, and we'll go into a few of the things that make it cool, but you can't really quite appreciate just how cool it is until you learn all of its details. And we'll have a few lectures in the shell module that go more into this. But for now, we'll just give you a taste of some of the things that make it cool. And once you learn a few of these things, you'll learn a little bit more about how to turn your house into a home. Now we're going to review some of the things that Josh talked about. There are three main commands that Josh talked about that you'll need to use anytime you're interacting with the shell. One of them is ls. ls stands for list, and it will list all of the files and folders in the current directory. Another command is cd, change directory. What cd will do is it will change your current directory to be a subdirectory of your current directory, or it can change your directory to be anywhere else in your current computer. So for instance, if I typed cd class, then it would change my directory from being in my home folder to being in my class folder. The other command that Josh talked about was man, which stands for manual, and if you type man followed by another command, it will open up the manual page for that command, which means that for ls, for instance, it tells you how to use ls. So it'll tell you exactly everything that you could ever care to know about ls, and much more than you really need to know, but if you just want to learn more about a certain command, or if something that we say is unclear, then you can always just look into the man page, and you can see exactly how to use the command. Now to go into something new, we're going to talk about relative versus absolute paths. When you're getting around somewhere with cd, you don't just want to be able to go into the folders that are subdirectories of the current directory. If I just type cd cs144, that would take me into my cs144 folder, but what if I wanted to go back up here? If I wanted to go up to my downloads folder, I can't just type cd downloads because there is no such file or directory downloads in my current directory. If you type cd, it will just look in your current directory in order to try to change to that directory. What that means is that I need to specify exactly where the downloads folder is that I want to change into it. One of the most useful locations that you can use is the tilde key. If I say cd tilde, then that will say take me home. Tilde stands for home. You'll see over here I have my path displayed, where I currently am, and here it's tilde /clash/cs144. That means that right now I'm home, here I'm in my cs144 folder. So you can see if I type ls again, that it's the same as it was up here, meaning that I'm in the same folder that I was up here, whereas when I was at this point in time, I was in my class folder, so it displayed different results because that was in the class folder, whereas this is in my home folder. Let's say that I want to go into something that is multiple levels down. So I don't want to cd into my class folder and then cd into my cs144 folder. I want to cd directly there. I would have to then type cd class/cs144. If you see a backslash in the middle of a path, then that is a delimiter between folders, meaning you have a slash in between every folder. So if I type cd class/cs144, it will take me directly to my cs144 folder. What if I want to not just use my own home folder, but what if I want to see something that's in the computer as a whole? Then you go to what's called the root directory. If you type a slash and it's not in the middle, but it's at the very start, then that means start at the very root of the computer. Go to, this would be the equivalent of my computer or the C drive in Windows. Now, if I type ls here, you'll see that it's not the same as my home. It has a bunch of really kind of obscure things inside of it. It has user and var and bin and home and etc. And these aren't really things that are my personal files. They're the files that belong to the computer as a whole. If you ever need to go into the root of the computer, which you will for some things that we talk about later on, you'll need to start with a slash at the beginning of your directory. And what this means also is that let's say that I was in home. If I wanted to directly access the bin directory in my root, I would have to type cd/bin, and then that would say there's a slash at the start, which means that I'm starting at the root, and I am then, from the root, going into the bin folder. And then that'll take me into bin. If instead of going to the exact root or to the exact home, let's say that I was back in my home/class/cs144 folder, and that I wanted to go to my class folder, but I didn't want to have to worry about going all the way home. Or even, let's make it more compelling. So inside my cs144 folder, I could go to my assignment for dynamic routing folder. And I don't want to have to type tilde/clash/cs144. I just want to go to cs144. In order to do that, you can type cd ... Stands for the directory above the current directory. What that means is that it'll take you one directory up. You can always use this if you know that you want to just go one directory away from the current directory. So you can see here, I used to be in the assignment 4 folder, which was inside the cs144 folder, which was inside the class folder. Then I typed cd ... and I got into the cs144 folder, cd ... again, class folder. If I type cd ... again, it'll take me into my home folder. What if I want to refer to the current folder? This isn't something you'll ever want to do with cd, because if I refer to the current folder and just go to the current folder, then that would be saying, change my directory from the current folder to the current folder. So it doesn't really do anything. But if you do, for some command, need to refer to the current folder, then you can just type a single dot. This is useful if you need to use a command that can work on any number of directories, and You might want that command to refer to the current directory, you might want that command to refer to some absolute directory, you might want it to refer to anything else. So if you do need that, then you can just use the dot key. The next thing to talk about is tab completion. Tab completion will save you a ton of time typing. Let's say that I want to go into my assignment for dynamic routing folder, but I don't want to type all of class and then all of CS144 and then all of assignment for dynamic routing. I can instead type cd, cl, press tab. It automatically completes class. Then if I press C and then press tab, it will automatically complete CS144. Then if I press A and press tab, you'll actually see it only completes the first part of assignment. It doesn't automatically go to assignment for dynamic routing. Let's try pressing tab again. Here you can see that there are actually 4 different folders that start with assignment in the current folder. What that means is that when I just typed the A and then hit tab, my tab completion didn't know how to completely complete it. So sometimes after you press tab, it'll fill in as much as it knows how to do, and then you have to give it a little bit more information. So here I just type the character 4 and then press tab again, and it'll complete everything for me. Tab completion is extremely useful because it means that you don't need to type the entirety of every single command that you need to type. Tab completion lets you also complete some different commands. We talked earlier about the difference between C shell and Z shell. C shell doesn't have all of these features. Every shell that you use, even if it's a basic one like C shell, will have tab completion like we just did. So if you type in the first letter and then type tab, it'll complete the rest of the ones based on the files that are in that directory. But if you're in Z shell, then it can do some things that are even more complicated. So for instance, there's one command that deals with file permissions that we'll talk about in the file permissions module called chmod. I always had a hard time with the syntax for using chmod, but when I'm using the Z shell and it has tab completion, I actually don't have to worry about that. If I type chmod and then press tab, then it'll say, who do I want to change the permissions of? Do I want to change the permissions for everybody, for the group, for others, for the user? Let's say I want to give myself more permissions, so you. And then what operator do I want to use? Do I want to add permissions or do I want to take away permissions? Let's say I want to give myself permissions, so I want to add them. Then I press tab again, and it'll say, what permissions do I want to change? Let's say that I want to give myself execute permissions, so I type u plus x. And I accidentally right-clicked, which pastes everything, but let's say that I type chmod u plus x, and then now, when I press tab, it shows me a list of all of the current files in the directory, and if I want to add execute permissions to simple.topo, then I can type in simple and press tab, and it'll complete the rest, and I could do all of that without having to remember off the top of my head all of the syntax for chmod, and it worked completely as desired. When you're using something like Z shell, you can also customize the tab completion. So for instance, let's say that I was in one level above my current folder, so cd ... There are 4 different assignments here, and I know that each of them has 1, 2, 3, and 4 in them. So if my tab completion was intelligent, I might be able to just type one number rather than having to type assignment followed by that number. Let's see if that works. cd4, tab, and everything works. That's because in Z shell, it actually has error correction, so it can look into the file or folder that you're going to work with, and it can see, is any of them a closer match to the input? Okay, then I'll use that one. This feature does not exist in shells like C shell, and the reason that we're using Z shell is because it's so customizable and because you can have it do things like that. It's extremely powerful, and we'll have instructions on exactly how to set it up in the lecture notes associated with this video. The next thing that we're going to talk about is command history. Let's say that I'm in my home directory, but I want to go back to my assignment 4 folder, and I don't want to have to type out that whole thing. Like, tab completion made it pretty easy, but that would require a lot of typing. If I press up a bunch of times, then that will take me through all of the commands that I have previously executed. So if I type up a bunch of times, it'll eventually take me to this command, cd class cs144 assignment for dynamic routing. Then if I press enter, it'll just execute that command again. If you press up, it takes you to previously executed commands. If you press down, it goes down. You have a command history, and that means that if you ever want to re-execute a command that you recently executed, you just type up, and then you can pretty much re-execute that command. The last mechanical thing that I want to talk about is how to get out of getting trapped. So let's say that I open a text editor called Vim, which is pretty complicated, and I'm editing the simple.topo file. Now, if I try to move around, if I try to type something, it actually won't type because Vim is what's called a modal editor, and we'll talk about that in the text editors module. If I try to get out, I can't type I can't type like Control W to exit or anything like that. It just won't work. And there isn't any button anywhere around the screen that tells me how to exit. How do I get out? There are a few commands that I can use that can help you out of situations like these. Control C is the one that you'll use most often. If I type Control C now, it'll pop up at the bottom here, information that says type :quit, enter to exit Vim. So if I type :quit and hit enter, it will exit Vim. Control C is what's called a keyboard interrupt. It will send an interrupt to your program, which most programs will exit. Vim actually catches the interrupt and tells you how to exit, and most other programs will do the same thing. This is particularly useful if you start a program that just is running for a really long time and you want to close it because you don't want it to take up all of your shell and you don't really need to run it, or maybe you used a command with the wrong arguments. So let's say you just typed find, which is a command that's used to find a particular file. If you just type command, if you type find followed by slash, then it will search for every file in the root. That means every file on this computer as a whole. And that's not what we want to do because there are a ton of those files. I type Control C and it gets me out of it. Wonderful, and it can save you a lot of time if something would otherwise cause you to need to close your entire terminal. Let's see if that works in Python. Here I'm typing Control C, and it's just saying keyboard interrupt. This is called a keyboard interrupt, so it makes sense that it would say keyboard interrupt, but I would generally expect it to actually close the program. Python isn't being very nice though, so we actually have to do something different. If we want to quit, we would have to type Control D. D stands for disconnect, and it will disconnect you from a process. This is most often used for getting out of the shell, so if I pressed Control D right now, it would actually close my entire shell. And if you were a little bit extra eager and when you were following along, you pressed Control D a bunch of times, then it would actually it would actually have closed your shell for you. And that's generally not what we want to do. So usually Control C as a keyboard interrupt will do exactly what you want. The other option that we have though is, let's say that we were running Vim again on simple.topo. And we pressed Control C, but we didn't notice that Control quit at the bottom. So another option that we have is Control Z. Control Z takes us out of the current process and suspends it. What this means is it basically puts it into the background, so it kind of is like minimizing it. If we want to see all the processes that we have Control Z'd, we can type jobs, and it will give us a list of them. If we want to go back into that process, we type FG, which stands for foreground, and it will take us back into that process. If we type Control Z again, then we can see that we're back into the shell. We can type jobs again and see all of the jobs that we have. If we type BG, it will resume that process in the background, so it'll say that it continued this one. And we'll still leave the process around, so it's generally not as good as Control C, and usually you will be using Control C or Control D, but Control Z is just kind of an extra option. Just to review the things that we went over today, there were the relative versus absolute paths. So there's, if you want to go home, tilde. If you want to go to the root directory, \. If you want to go one directory up, then .. which won't really work in the root directory. If we want to refer to the current directory, then use a dot. And if we want to go multiple levels down, we would have a \ in between each directory. So /bin, or if we go /boot/grub, then that would take us to the grub folder within the boot folder. Whenever you're doing this, you should be using the tab key in order to automatically complete for you so that you don't have to type out everything. You can press the up arrow to go to previous commands and down to go to around in your tab history. And if you get trapped, use Control-C, Control-D, or Control-Z. And just to prove what I was saying earlier about Control-D closing your shell, if we press Control-D now, it will quit, and we're back to home sweet home.